Well, let's get started. Welcome to lecture 23, if I've done the math right, of the planets. Today we're going to change course quite dramatically and talk not about physics of planets, nor their chemistry, nor mineralogy, nor the atmospheric science of planets, nor rings, nor moons, nor asteroids per se. But instead, we're going to talk in today's lecture and next week after Thanksgiving, the following Tuesday, we're going to talk about the attribute of our home planet Earth that makes it extraordinary from a scientific standpoint and heartwarming from our own personal human standpoint. And of course, we're talking about life. It's rather remarkable that we have discussed all semester long the inhabitants of our solar system in planetary terms: asteroids, comets, rings, moons. They're all natural phenomena. The planets formed out of the gas and dust in the early solar planetary, protoplanetary disk. And the Earth, as a rocky planet, formed at the same time out of the same stuff as Venus did, or Mars, or Mercury, and indeed the other planets. So the Earth is a part of the solar system in a very natural way, made of the same atomic material, molecules, a sequence of planets from Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, and outward. But it's obvious that the Earth is a special planet. There's something extraordinary about the planet Earth, and we all know that it really comes down to the presence of life, biology, here on the Earth. Why is it that the Earth has life and the other planets don't, or certainly not advanced life? The jury is still out about whether Mars might have microbial, bacterial life. But the Earth is teeming with life, and you might ask, how did this happen? What happened on the Earth maybe 4 billion years ago? Something about the initial conditions, the chemistry, the temperature, something about the interior of the Earth in some way allowed life to get a foothold, a toehold, and flourished and evolved into the intelligent species that we humans think of ourselves. Today's lecture is going to be about the origin of life and the nature of life here on the Earth, partly because biology is so spectacular here on the Earth, and partly because life might have gotten started somewhere else, maybe on other planets like the ones we've been discussing that orbit other stars. And so if we could just get a sense as to what the properties are of the Earth that allowed biochemistry to lead to life here on the Earth, maybe we could understand what environmental conditions are needed for life elsewhere. So I'm going to give a lecture today that's about 35 minutes long, and then I'm going to show 2.5 videos that I love. One of them is perhaps my favorite video of all time. Another one is even better than it. And then the third one has lots of details. And I thought it was appropriate, since all of you are here today, 2 days before Thanksgiving, so many other students have already left campus, that you might enjoy seeing some of my favorite videos on the origin of life and the nature of life here on the Earth after I give a preamble, an introduction. So let me start with this first slide. You can see a summary of today's lecture. We're going to talk about the nature of the Earth geologically, early on, 4 billion years ago, when there was plenty of volcanism and the Earth's atmosphere was nothing like what it is today. I'm going to get my laser pointer out. And then we're going to move on to the chemistry that surely took place back then 4 billion years ago, which we have reproduced in the lab. I'll describe that, producing some of the building blocks of life, including DNA, that makes up the code, the computer code for life that we all know about. I'll just remind you that there's not any homework due this week. In case you were wondering, it'll be due next Friday, a week from Friday, and it's all on chapter 24. 24 is a marvelous chapter in the book on the origin of the nature of the evolution of life. So the homework will be due in a week, not this Friday, but next Friday. And that's the last homework assignment of the semester, believe it or not. No more lunar eclipses, no more solar eclipses, no more cosmic coincidences. Let me start with a question that you might want to ask, and that is, what in the world is life? How do you define life? How can you tell the difference between life and other things in nature that seem to change? There's no answer to this question, and I'd like to explore why there's no answer. There's kind of a humorous answer. The Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart once said, and this is a quote, "I shall not attempt to define it further, but I know it when I see it." He wasn't talking about life when he made this proclamation. I think he was talking about pornography. Couldn't define that either. But we're going to stick to talking about life in today's lecture. I'm going to play it safe. And of course, life elsewhere could be fundamentally different from biology here on the Earth. So why should we go to the trouble of trying to define it too carefully? As soon as we find life somewhere else, we may have to change our definition. But I'll offer you a few quirky aspects of life. If I asked you, is a crystal alive? You could make a pretty good argument that a crystal is alive. Why? What would you argue? Well, you could say that a crystal has many of the properties that we associate with life. For example, crystals have an ordered arrangement of the molecules of which the crystal is made. So does your human body, so does a worm or a bacteria. The atoms aren't just randomly placed. The atoms are placed in a very specific order to carry out the functions of your human body or even that of a bacteria. Of course, crystals grow. You start with a small one, they make more crystals. You can see it right here. So crystals, in effect, reproduce. That's an attribute we normally associate with life. Crystals grow, they develop, they change, as does life. Crystals use energy from their environment, otherwise the bonds wouldn't form. They also need water quite often. And crystals will respond to the environment. If you try to grow a crystal in a closed space, the crystal will grow to accommodate that closed space. And you might ask, do crystals have genes? Well, not exactly in the same way that we humans and other animals and plants have genes. Nonetheless, there's something about the structure of a crystal that reproduces itself, as we'll discuss, much in the same way that DNA reproduces itself. So a crystal is frighteningly close to what we might call life. And in fact, if you look at it a little more carefully, crystals obviously have ordered arrangements of molecules, they grow and develop, they use energy, and they almost satisfy some of these other properties that we naturally, ever since we were kids, associate with life. So the definition of life is very tricky. Now, life on the Earth has some very interesting properties that give us clues about its origin. And the most impressive fact I can tell you about life is that, of course, the Earth and the Sun formed 4.5 billion years ago, but within just 1 billion years, even less than that, there are fossil signs of life. In other words, the Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago, and within 1 billion years, there was already life here on the Earth, as we see in the fossil record. Another thing about life is that it depends here on the Earth, all life forms do, on a few atoms. The most common atoms that you see here in the periodic table, like hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, I've listed them here. Just a handful of atoms allow you to build amino acids, proteins, and DNA. And so life depends on, interestingly, some of the most common atoms in the universe. The building blocks of life, atomically, are everywhere in our solar system, in the Milky Way galaxy, and elsewhere in the universe. So there's no question that if you were, how shall I say, a chef of life, you could cook up biology in the kitchen just with a few of the atoms at your fingertips. And indeed, these atoms, hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, a few others, nitrogen, when combined, form molecules. In particular, they're called organic molecules, and the definition of an organic molecule is any molecule that has carbon in it, and typically hydrogen and some oxygen, and maybe other atoms. But carbon-based molecules are a whole field of chemistry called organic chemistry. And right in this very lecture hall, some of you may know friends, you may even be taking a class in organic chemistry. Some people specialize in organic chemistry, the chemistry of carbon-based molecules, because they are the molecules of life. And interestingly, there are some organic molecules that have the natural ability, obeying the laws of physics and chemistry, to reproduce themselves, to replicate themselves like a Xerox machine, a photocopier. So some molecules, and we'll talk about it in a moment, have the ability to reproduce themselves. And you already know this. DNA is a molecule that can make a copy of itself just by obeying the laws of physics and chemistry. Atoms coming close to other atoms, ripping themselves apart from the other atoms, and then reattaching in a form that produces a duplicate or near duplicate of the original molecule. That's an amazing attribute of some organic molecules. They can copy themselves, and you can already see where this will lead, and I'll talk about it in a few minutes. And then here on the Earth, it's also true that life, all life, is based on a unit called the cell. You learned about it in 8th grade. All cells have organs interior to the cell wall, sometimes called the cell membrane. And so there's a cell membrane that allows molecules to go in and out of the cell. The cell can regulate which molecules come in and which molecules can go out. The cell can communicate with the outside world, changing its chemistry, and the outside world with its chemistry can communicate interior to the cell through the selective communication membrane. And then, of course, there's a nucleus inside all cells that have DNA that reproduce. I'll remind you of what you already know. And then one very fundamental fact, which is easy to verify in just a matter of days in the lab, is that simple life forms evolve. Bacteria reproduce so quickly you can demonstrate evolution in the lab in a matter of a few days. You start off with certain population of bacteria, and as they reproduce and produce children, offspring, they are a little different from their parents, and the most successful bacteria in surviving are the ones that can pass on their genes to the next generation of bacteria, and so on. Every few minutes or hours, the bacteria can change from one generation to the next, coping with whatever environmental challenges that they face. And so they can literally change, not an individual, but as a species, as a population, from one generation to the next. You can see evolution happen before your very eyes within a week in a biology lab. So evolution is just normal, and it's so powerful, bacteria in particular being an easy way to do the test, that it's such a powerful principle that bacteria can even evolve to survive in extreme environments. Temperatures nearly boiling, acidity, worse acidity than battery acid, and so on. So evolution allows species to pass on their genes to those that can survive in harsh environments. Evolution is that powerful. Now, you already know that DNA reproduces itself because you learned it in school, but I wanted to remind you that DNA, being a double helix, as shown here, has these molecules, pairs of molecules that connect. They're sometimes called base pairs. And the DNA molecule, this curly Q double helix, has the ability to break apart, as you see here, into two strands. And then these molecules can split apart, and they tend to bond with a mate that is the proper mate, the only mate of that one molecule. So each of these molecules here, when DNA splits apart, each of these lonely base pair members then can attach to a new set of molecules that are the same type that they broke apart from before. And therefore DNA, in a chemical way, there's no brain here, there's no mastermind, no puppeteer. This is just the physics of chemistry. Molecules naturally bonding to other molecules, and thereby allow one molecule to always bond to its normal neighbor. And there are these base pairs where there's one type of molecule that always bonds with another, and so on, allowing DNA to reproduce. And this is, of course, happening in your body all the time. And the reproduction is very, very efficient. It's very rare that your body makes a mistake, or that of a plant or an animal. It's very rare that they make a mistake in their copying, although occasionally there are chemical mistakes. So, to remind you of a key aspect, the fossil record shows that the first forms of life formed very quickly, organic molecules formed quickly, RNA and DNA formed quickly within 1 billion years, and that happened right after the crust of the Earth solidified. Remember that the early Earth was bombarded by protoplanets, asteroids, comets, Mars-sized objects that formed the moon, multiple huge impacts that, of course, melted, kept the surface of the crust melted. There was no hard crust, but over the millions of years, the crust eventually cooled and solidified, the bombardments went away, and the fossil record shows that very shortly after the hard crust of the Earth formed, we see signs of life. And the basic cell, the basic unit of the cell was there very early on. This is a powerful message. The physics and chemistry that led to replicating molecules happened on the Earth within a few blinks of an eye. And the suggestion, of course, is obvious. On another Earth-like planet, a planet with lukewarm temperatures and liquid water to serve as the chemical cocktail mixer, that water would mix the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen and phosphorus and nitrogen together in ways that over the course of hundreds, thousands, millions of years would eventually stumble upon the same sorts of chemical reactions that we enjoy here on the Earth. What I've said just there is a bit of a hypothesis, you might say, but it's been borne out with experiment. And the first one was done by Urey and Miller in the 1950s. And what they did was so simple, you sort of hit your head and you say, why didn't I think of that? What these two folks did was to combine, indeed, the most common atoms and molecules that we know of in the universe. Hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, H2O, NH3, CH4. Carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, throw them together, you get these simple molecules. We see them in comets, asteroids, interstellar clouds. We see these molecules in other galaxies. These molecules are the most common molecules in the universe. And what these two guys did was they said, okay, let's take some of those molecules, let's put them in a glass flask right here, and then they ran a high voltage spark across those gases and liquids. The spark, of course, has energy, breaks apart some of the molecules, and then they recombine, obeying the laws of physics and chemistry. However the molecules will recombine, that's what they will do in that glass flask. The spark was an attempt to simulate lightning, because, of course, here on the Earth, lightning is a way to inject energy into chemicals when they may react. But there are many other ways to inject energy. There's, of course, geysers. There's hot thermal volcanic vents at the bottom of the ocean. There's ultraviolet light coming from the sun, and so on. So this was just one way, using a spark to simulate a lightning bolt, one way to inject energy into the molecules, break them apart, and allow them to recombine however the atoms will. And the resulting molecules fell down through this glass tubing, down into this trap where it was kept cold. And people analyzed, they in particular, but other people since them, have analyzed what molecules result. What do you get from doing this simple chemistry experiment in the lab? And the answer is, you get a whole suite of carbon-based molecules that are much more complex than the simple ones that went in. And you can see that many of these are complex hydrocarbons with hydrogen, carbon, oxygen. There are some acids. Many of these are amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. And it's an amazing reality. You just take simple molecules, you bash them with a hammer, i.e. the lightning bolt, and they break apart and recombine into complex organics of which your human body is composed. And you may know, if you took a little bit of biology, that life as we know it here on the Earth is based on 20 amino acids. You see them here. And these are indeed some of the amino acids produced naturally by the Urey-Miller experiment. So the building blocks of life, the rather complex building blocks of life, the amino acids, simply occur naturally in nature. And indeed, not just in the lab, but in comets and molecular clouds in between the stars, we see amino acids. What do I mean by see? Well, we can take a spectrum of the light from a comet or a molecular cloud, and the spectrum of light that you learned about in week 5 shows the spectral lines from amino acids. So these chemical reactions are occurring naturally. The building blocks of life are happening in the inert outer reaches of our galaxy. So this is an amazing reality, and of course it brings us back to the early days. What must the Earth have been like 3.5 billion years ago? Imagine if you could close your eyes and transport yourself in a time machine to 3.5 billion years ago. What would you see? If you could be right here in Berkeley 3.5 billion years ago, what would you see around you? Well, the best estimates, based on the mineralogical record, is that the Earth had many more volcanoes. Why? Because the interior of the Earth was much hotter. The crust was very thin. Volcanoes could burst through and spurt out. There must have been volcanoes all the time within sight. Those volcanoes would have spewed up the complex molecules and gases that come out of volcanoes, especially carbon dioxide, nitrogen, sulfuric acid, and so on. So the outgassing by volcanoes produces the molecules that make up our atmosphere and some of our oceans. I've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. Early on in the solar system, 4 billion years ago, there were many more comets and asteroids. They hadn't yet gone into the sun or crashed into the Earth or been flung out into space. So comets were hitting the Earth on a daily basis. And comets, as you now know, contain water and also carbon-based organic molecules. So the comets were delivering the stuff of life, the ingredients, the key ingredients for the recipe of life were being delivered by comets, water and organics. And, of course, heavy bombardment by those comets and asteroids was still happening real time, and so occasionally a really massive object would hit the Earth, evaporate the oceans, blast the atmosphere away, and the poor Earth had to start again from scratch. So you can imagine that the chemistry of life might have had to start multiple times as these impacts by asteroids and comets destroyed some of the work that they had actually enabled in the first place. There is a record, a mineralogical record using radioactive dating of the rocks, of very old rocks, 4 billion years old. There's some in Australia, 4.2 billion years old. By old, remember what that means. When you say a rock has a certain age, you mean that it solidified from molten rock that long ago. So we know that there are rocks here today on the surface of the Earth that are 4 billion years old. That's apparently when the crust solidified of the Earth, and as we know, very soon thereafter are signs of life. And one sign of life is this. You see in very old rocks, here's one 3.9 billion years old. By the way, GA is a geologist's way of saying giga-years ago. Giga-year is a billion years. So 3.9 billion years ago, 3.9 ga, rocks looked like this. And when they analyze these stripes, these layers, they are rich in a type of carbon, carbon-12, that is common to life. Carbon also, as you know, comes in carbon-13 and carbon-14. Remember, that means an extra neutron or 2 extra neutrons in the nucleus. But life tends to have carbon-12, and indeed these layers are rich in carbon-12. They were laid down, those layers were, by species that existed 3.9 billion years ago, died in some catastrophic event, and left a layer of their remains in the rocks. And so we're seeing early signs of life some 3.9 billion years ago. The point being how quickly life sprang into existence here on the Earth. Now, there's a puzzle. You all know that when you go to the beach and you want to get a tan to impress your friends, it's a great idea to lay out on the beach and take most of your clothes off. But you also know that it's not a great idea, because the ultraviolet light that gives you a tan also can cause cancer. And that's because ultraviolet light breaks apart organic molecules. A CH bond, carbon and hydrogen, those CH bonds are fragile. And when a UV photon comes in, that UV photon can break apart the bond, destroying the organic molecule. So ultraviolet light is damaging to organic molecules. That's in part how you get a mutation or how you can get cancer. You're breaking apart molecules in your DNA and you make a mutation that's not good for you. So you might ask, early in the Earth's history, how did the first life forms protect themselves against ultraviolet light? Well, nowadays we do that by enjoying the ozone layer. Remember, 3 oxygen atoms, O3, not the O2 that you breathe, but O3 that's in the stratosphere of the Earth, is a wonderful thing because it absorbs ultraviolet light. That's what heats the stratosphere and so on. Great. But there wasn't any oxygen early in the history of the Earth. How could there have been oxygen? You need plant life to do photosynthesis to produce the oxygen that would then protect the plant life. So there's a kind of a vicious cycle, a catch-22. You can't have plant life unless it's protected from UV, but you can't have UV unless you have the plant life to produce the oxygen. So something has to give. There has to be some way that life can get started and not be destroyed by the ultraviolet light before the photosynthetic process can kick in, plants can cover the Earth, produce enough oxygen to protect us with ozone. And there's no real known answer to this question, but I'll tell you one that many of the molecular biologists who study the origin of life favor, and that is that maybe life got started in the ocean. There were oceans early on, of course, and down near the bottom of oceans are often found volcanoes. They're called volcanic vents, but they're just volcanoes to you and me. Geysers, volcanoes. Lots of complex organic molecules come out of the volcanoes. Nitrogen-rich and carbon-rich molecules come out of the volcanoes. You see 2 pictures. These are actual photographs of them here. And what's seen inside those gases coming out of the volcano are primitive forms of life. Life can thrive in the warm, hot, liquid ocean bottoms near these volcanic vents. And the beauty of those volcanic vents is that being down at the bottom of the ocean, the water above those vents protects the early life forms from the ultraviolet light. So if you're worried about poor primitive life protecting itself from being destroyed, no ozone layer, the ocean can do the trick. And then you can imagine life evolving, coming up to the surface, some of it being plant life, and the photosynthetic process can take off and produce enough oxygen to yield ozone. But one really exciting possibility is that life, perhaps, nobody knows for sure, got started in the bottoms of oceans in volcanic vents rich in these organic molecules. Now, that brings us to the question, fine, life might have gotten kick-started in oceans or wherever, maybe in ponds or lakes, but how did it become complex? And of course, that brings in Charles Darwin. Most thoughtful people, most scientists, when they think about which scientist in the history of humanity had the greatest impact, provided the most important ideas to science, they don't point to Einstein, they don't point necessarily to Isaac Newton, but they often point to Darwin. And I'll give you a little flavor as to why Darwin's ideas were simple and yet powerful. He wrote a book on the origin of species in 1859. Most of you know that. The idea behind evolution you also know. I'll remind you. Evolution simply means change with time, with generations. From one generation to the next, species change. And indeed, the fossil record shows unambiguously that species change from year to year, century to century, millennium to millennium. There's multiple millions, I would say, of examples in the fossil record of species that changed over time, whether they were bacteria, bugs, birds, fish, mammals. They all changed with time. You can see places where the Earth split apart due to plate tectonics, and when they split apart, the species on one continent evolved in one direction. The same species that started with them but was on the other continent evolved in a different direction, but they stemmed from a common ancestor. So evolution has multiple signs that prove that it exists. I'll give you more examples in a moment. And the idea is that the fossil record doesn't lie. It shows species changing with time. And Darwin noticed this over about a decade and articulated two basic observations. Let me tell you these two observations. They're so simple that they're just plain as day. Observation number one that Darwin made: any population can produce more children than the local environment can support, which causes a struggle for survival. Any species can make more babies, if you will, make more offspring that would just multiply and multiply and multiply over the generations. And so there has to be some competition for resources, food, water, perhaps survival against predators, and so on. So observation number one, there would be way more members of a species if it wasn't for some challenge that the individuals face to simply survive from minute to minute, day to day, month, year to year. The second observation, which is obvious to all of you as well, is that the characteristics of the children resemble the characteristics of the parents. Traits are passed on from parents to children, but the children are not exactly like their parents. This is true of plants as well as animals. The offspring are very similar to, but not identical to, their parents. And so this leads to a very obvious conclusion. You simply take these two facts, these two observations, and the conclusion is shown at the bottom. Those members of a population, the individuals, that have characteristics that allow them most successfully to survive and reproduce, i.e. mate and have children, those individuals that have traits that allow them to survive and mate will, on average, produce the greatest number of offspring. You can only have sex if you've survived long enough to have sex. And so those that survive the best will be the ones to produce children. It's just obvious. If you don't survive long enough, you won't produce kids. So there's a natural way that those individuals that have characteristics allowing them to survive in their environment against the predators, to use their natural resources, those are the ones that will have offspring. And of course, the offspring, guess what, will resemble their parents. And so you end up with a slow, methodical change, i.e. evolution, in a species toward members that can best survive in their local environment from one generation to the next. Those with the most advantageous, successful traits are the ones that pass on their traits. This is kind of boring. This is like, a lecture in a mathematics class. This really is just, what what will one equation yield? There's nothing magical here. There's no subtlety. You have to survive to have sex. The people that survive the best are going to be the ones to have children. So that's evolution, and of course it's borne out, as I've said, by the fossil record, millions and millions of different ways, different species, demonstrated by biologists over a century, have indeed changed over time. And there's therefore a theory that I've more or less just articulated, called the theory of evolution, but as I say, it's almost like a mathematical reality. Evolution is as secure as a quote-unquote theory as the theory of gravity. There is a theory of gravity, but none of you would doubt that if I drop this laser pointer, it really, really, really will fall. You just wouldn't doubt it because you've seen things fall enough times. And so it is with evolution. We've seen species evolve enough times. There really isn't any doubt. It's a very causal, deterministic kind of process, evolution is. What's missing is, or was missing to Charles Darwin, was the microscopic mechanism. He simply noticed, as do all of you, that children resemble their parents. But why? Why does this happen? And of course you know the answer because you took biology in high school. Darwin didn't know about genes. He didn't know about molecules. He didn't know about DNA. But you do. And you know that there's a relationship, that the mechanism by which the children are a little different from their parents, or maybe a lot different from their parents, has to do with something microscopic that took a new generation of biologists. And it wasn't until the 1950s that Rosalind Franklin, Francis Crick, and James Watson studied the interior of the nuclei of cells and discovered this amazing double helix molecule called DNA. They saw that it broke apart and came together, reproducing itself. All of you, again, know the structure. The most important thing for you to remember about DNA, if you aren't going to take any biology classes here at Berkeley, the most important thing to remember is that this complicated molecule, DNA, can be ultra-simplified into its 4 components. Guanine always mates with cytosine, and adenine always mates with thymine. People abbreviate these as G, C, A, and T. And all DNA, whether it's in a bacterium, a plant, an animal, all of them have the same exact DNA with these 4 molecules making it up. And it's the order of those molecules as you go down the chain of DNA. The order of those 4 determine what you are, determine everything about your human body, and the same for all the plants and animals. DNA is the basis of all life, and it's simply a matter of what order the G, C, A, T come in along the path. So the mechanism of evolution, which Darwin couldn't have known, but now we have a good way of knowing, is based on these 4 bases, as they're called, that make up DNA. Organisms reproduce themselves by copying their DNA, passing a copy from one parent and the other parent combined together to produce a near copy from their parents, but of course each parent is contributing half of the DNA. And moreover, sometimes the copies are not perfect. There are billions of these molecules inside a DNA molecule, billions of base pairs, and so occasionally a chemical mistake will happen, the reaction isn't quite right, and so you can get some imperfections. And sometimes these 4 base pairs, sometimes called nucleic acids, are not actually in the right order that they should have been in, and so you get offspring that are different in some way. Their eyesight is worse or better, their fingernails are longer or shorter, their teeth are longer or shorter, and you never know which of those attributes might be helpful or hurtful in their ability to survive and reproduce. So now the mechanism for evolution is becoming more clear. You have DNA, the parents mate, they produce offspring that are close copies of, but not perfect copies of each other, and eventually you can end up with DNA that's not quite right, and therefore offspring that are a little different from their parents. And of course, when the changes are dramatic enough, when the faults, the mistakes in the copying are dramatic enough, we call those mutations. Changes in a single base pair that shouldn't have happened. And you don't know whether that will be helpful to the species, to the member of that species, or hurtful. And by the way, you can see here on average, 1 in 100,000 copies have an error. So out of 100,000 base pairs, 1 out of 100,000 gets screwed up. Nature chemically has a way to notice this, break apart the mistake, and fix it, but 1 in a million or even 1 in a billion don't get fixed. So even in your own body, you have mutations in your DNA passed down from maybe dozens or even hundreds of generations back. You carry those mutations with you because your mom gave it to you, and her dad gave it to her, and his father gave it to him, and so on, and the mutations just continue along. So now there's a mechanism for evolution. Children aren't exactly like their parents because they get copies of half of the DNA from each, and there can be mistakes. And so you end up with members of a species that might have advantages in survival over their fellow members of the species. And of course, going back to ultraviolet light, X-rays, and even high-energy particles can break apart DNA and cause a mistake. So, of course, high-energy photons and particles are not so good. And you know, probably all of you know of some diseases like cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy, sickle cell anemia, and so on, are often caused by these mistakes in DNA. Now, I'm done with the lecture that I wanted to give, and I wanted to quit early because I have 2 videos that I really, really like, I've already mentioned, and so I hope you'll sit back and enjoy prior to our Thanksgiving weekend coming up. 2 videos. One is Ultra Precious by Carl Sagan, and another one is Even More Precious by another favorite of mine, Neil deGrasse Tyson. So here we go with 2 videos. This is Carl Sagan.
All my life I've wondered about life beyond the Earth. On those countless other planets that we think circle other suns, is there also life? Might the beings of other worlds resemble us, or would they be astonishingly different? What would they be made of? In the vast Milky Way galaxy, how common is what we call life? The nature of life on Earth and the quest for life elsewhere are the 2 sides of the same question, the search for who we are. All living things on Earth are made of organic molecules, a complex microscopic architecture built around atoms of carbon. In the great dark between the stars, there also are organic molecules in immense clouds of gas and dust. And inside such clouds, there are batches of new worlds just forming. Their surfaces are very likely covered with organic molecules. These molecules almost certainly are not made by life, although they are the stuff of life. On suitable worlds, they may lead to life. Organic matter is abundant throughout the cosmos, produced by the same chemistry everywhere. Perhaps, given enough time, the origin and evolution of life is inevitable on every clement world. There will surely be some planets too hostile for life. On others, it may arise and die out, or never evolve beyond its simplest forms. And on some small fraction of worlds, there may develop intelligences and civilizations more advanced than ours. All life on our planet is closely related. We have a common organic chemistry and a common evolutionary heritage, and so our biologists are profoundly limited. They study a single biology, one lonely theme in the music of life. Is it the only voice for thousands of light years, or is there a cosmic fugue, a billion different voices playing the life music of the galaxy? Black clouds, light years across, drift between the stars. They're filled with organic molecules. The building blocks of life are everywhere. They're easily made. On how many worlds have such complex molecules assembled themselves into patterns we would call alive? Some stars are flimsy as a soap bubble. Others are 100 trillion times denser than lead. The hottest stars are destined to die young, but red giants are mostly elderly. Such stars are unlikely to have inhabited planets. But yellow dwarf stars, like the Sun, are middle-aged, and they are far more common. These stars may have planetary systems, and on such planets, for the first time in our cosmic voyage, we encounter rare forms of matter: ice and rock, air and liquid water. Close to this yellow star is a small, warm, cloudy world with continents and oceans. These conditions permit an even more precious form of matter to arise: life. But this is not the Earth. Intelligent beings have evolved and reworked this planetary surface in a massive engineering enterprise. In the Milky Way galaxy, there may be many worlds on which matter has grown to consciousness. I wonder, are they very different from us? What do they look like? What are their politics, technology, music, religion? Or do they have patterns of culture we can't begin to imagine? Are they also a danger to themselves? The molecules of life fill the cosmos. Now, what would life elsewhere look like, even if it had an identical molecular chemistry to life on Earth, which I very much doubt? It could not be similar, very similar, in form to familiar organisms on the Earth. The random character of the evolutionary process must create elsewhere creatures very different from any that we know. Think of a world something like Jupiter, with an atmosphere rich in hydrogen, helium, methane, water, and ammonia, in which organic molecules might be falling from the skies like manna from heaven, like the products of the Miller-Urey experiment. Could there be life on such a world? Well, there's a special problem. The atmosphere is turbulent, and down deep, before we ever come to a surface, it's very hot. If you're not careful, you'll be carried down and fried. So one way to make a living is to reproduce before you're fried. Turbulence will carry some of your offspring to the higher and cooler layers. Such organisms could be very little. We call them sinkers. The physicist E.E. Salpeter and I at Cornell have calculated something about the other kinds of life that might exist on such a world. Vast living balloons could stay buoyant by pumping heavy gases from their interiors or by keeping their insides warm. They might eat the organic molecules in the air or make their own with sunlight. We call these creatures floaters.
Okay, I'm going to stop this
we
now because I want to go to the Neil deGrasse Tyson video, which is even more exciting. Maybe some of you know Neil deGrasse Tyson. He recently finished a TV series, and he's really a wonderful friend of mine and a marvelous teacher. So here's that one.